Thank you, Chair Sutton. Welcome to our Student Achievement Committee meeting. I appreciate your flexibility in starting a little early. I have not heard from Mr. Haggerty or Ms. Johnson-Hassler. Ms. Kushner, you're also on the committee. So that's 2 out of 3 official meeting committee members. So I think we're good with that. And we appreciate the other board members for attending. And today we are going to be talking about school improvement planning. So as we know, we have schools have finalized their plans, and Dr. McFarland and members of his team will be discussing that. Before we move into that part of the meeting, could I please get a motion to approve the November 23rd minutes?
Upon review, I move approval of the October minutes.
And do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. And the motion to approve the November 23rd minutes has been approved. And with that, we will just go right into our presentation. So I will turn things over to Dr. McFarland, who is joining us virtually.
So good afternoon, Committee Chair Scott, members of the board, and Superintendent Moore. I hope all of you were able to stay dry on your way in today on this rainy Monday. We're excited about the presentation today. Here to provide school improvement information is going to be Leanne Alford and Rob Epler. They're senior administrators to area superintendents. And in addition, Senior Administrator Tanika Holly and area superintendents Jonathan Enns and Dr. Valicia Council are also with us to help answer any questions that you may have this afternoon. Tanika, if you want to go ahead and pull up the presentation. And I'll just sort of start with our desired outcomes. We want to provide really an overview of the school improvement planning in general for the public and the board. And then more specifically, we want to provide the board with an update on what school improvement planning has looked like over the past several months in context of COVID. We know that schools have been engaged in revising their school improvement plans, considering the unique needs of the school community during this very unique time. This has been done in collaboration with principals, school improvement process managers, various departments within central services, and the Office of Area Superintendents. So our intent is really that when we are finished today, you will have a better understanding of the current state of school improvement in the Wake County public school system. And so with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Alford.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started by sharing with you the purpose statement of school improvement. The purpose of school improvement in the Wake County public school system is to improve achievement and outcomes for every student, intentionally working to eliminate performance predictability among subgroups by collaboratively and continuously analyzing data and making decisions considering the unique needs of the learning community and the district strategic plan. The NCDPI School Improvement Planning and Implementation Guide outlines 6 principles of school improvement: district role and support, distributed leadership, execute with fidelity, goal alignment, calendar alignment, and MTSS. We use MTSS as the framework for school improvement. Therefore, understanding and implementing this framework is critical to the school improvement process. MTSS is a multi-tiered framework which integrates research-based academic, behavioral, and social and emotional practices used by all schools to promote school improvement. There are 6 critical components of MTSS that are all reflected in the work of school improvement teams to ensure effective implementation of their school improvement plans. Schools administered the Facilitated Assessment of MTSS, also known as the FAMS, in spring 2020 prior to school closures. The FAM-S identifies which systems and structures may need improvement to ensure effective implementation of school improvement action steps. Area senior administrators and MTSS coaches facilitated the collaborative assessment process for each school. School improvement teams reflected on the FAM-S data as part of the data review, which precedes the development of school improvement plans. The data review is comprised of 3 narrative paragraphs summarizing data statements and trends. Implementation and student outcome data are both utilized for the data review. All WCPSS schools use the MTStar platform for school improvement plans. IndiStar is a national platform that has been customized by DPI as MTStar. School improvement teams set goals based on the data review and then prioritize indicators. The success cycle in NC-STAR includes assess, create, and monitor phases for each indicator. Indicators represent effective practices that schools are asked to assess their implementation of. When assessing, they identify the current state, the desired state, and determine if actions will be a priority this cycle. Actions represent the action steps schools will take to reach full implementation of the indicator. These are the 5 district indicators that all schools are asked to assess in WCPSS since 2018. These indicators were chosen because they have been found to be high-impact strategies based on research, and they were closely aligned to the MTSS Framework and our district's strategic plan. Multiple central services departments collaborated to choose these indicators. They are also 5 of the 12 key indicators that NCDPI requires for schools designated as low performing by the state in connection with legislative requirements in the Leandro decision. Considering everything that is going on, schools were still required by policy to start a new plan cycle this school year. Despite the challenging times, our schools worked very hard to engage in the school improvement process authentically. Over the summer, all certified staff participated in 4 foundational courses to learn about best practices in the blended learning environment. This gave a common foundation to each school improvement team as they were reflecting on school improvement plans. For each part of their plan, goals, actions, and indicators, schools needed to consider whether to continue their previous intentions or make modifications based on current needs, priorities, and data. Schools were given guidance on alternative data sources to consider in lieu of typical summative data. For instance, multiple central services departments collaborated to provide each school with their behavioral health needs assessment. This included a data set to be used as a general measure of the behavioral health of their school community and an accompanying protocol for problem solving and planning the needed response. Schools were also provided first quarter attendance and grades data to inform their work. An additional change we made was to include professional learning embedded in school improvement plan actions instead of requiring a separate planning document. Schools ended their previous plans in different places based on the abrupt, unexpected school closures. Therefore, even more so than before, differentiated supports were provided by the area senior administrators based on specific school needs. I will now turn it over to Rob Epler, who will share with you more about specific school supports.
Hi, good afternoon. So these were some of the questions that represented our mindset going into guidance and support this year. It was important to consider balance between flexibility and consistency. We wanted to avoid a rushed response to school improvement or drastic changes in priorities due to the ever-changing environment this year. We worked to provide schools with a foothold by relying on some traditional practices while also giving them concrete guidance and identifying areas of needed flexibility to match the current needs. Schools were provided with adjusted guidance based on the onset of the pandemic, and this guidance focused on 3 phases with data sources for consideration, guiding questions, and exemplars for each phase and section of the data review. Data reviews were used to consider what updates were needed to school improvement plan goals, indicators, and actions. The first phase of this focused on assessing progress through March 13th. As a result of the school closures, schools utilized available outcome data that's not typically used for school improvement end-of-the-year data reviews. Many of the COVID-19 data metrics included are formative in nature, often used in quarterly reviews, and therefore needed to be considered in conjunction with historical data for the school year 2020 and 2021 planning. Schools were also provided the equity impact analysis by the Office of Equity Affairs to reflect on these data sources. And phase one had to be considered for needs assessment data, student outcomes, and progress towards indicator implementation. During phase two, to monitor equity of student access and participation, school improvement teams collected data on remote learning, such as attendance at class meetings, internet and device access, and submission of assignments. School improvement teams also solicited student, parent, or teacher feedback through surveys to monitor the successes or challenges of this phase. Then in phase three, schools engaged in database problem solving to identify gaps and responded to student needs. Key data considered were grades and attendance from quarter one, the behavioral health needs assessment, and previous implementation of the priority indicators. The data review is a synthesis of multiple data sources from previous years across phases 1, 2, and 3. School improvement plans are a response to this comprehensive synthesis of the data. And school improvement teams updated goals, implementation definitions, and actions for priority indicators as indicated by their data. Principals, assistant principals, and school improvement team chairs attended regional meetings to receive information about the mechanics of updating school improvement plans, as well as protocols that they could use for collaborating effectively. During these school leadership meetings, area senior administrators provided updates targeted to principals' needs. This includes differentiated support and one-on-one coaching was also provided to school leaders based on these topics. So similarly, between the topics, both of those things were provided. Area senior administrators and the MTSS coaches sometimes facilitated school improvement team meetings to promote collaboration as well. In addition to the meetings and coaching sessions, multiple resources and exemplars were provided for use with school improvement teams, as well as asynchronous video tutorials for the NC STAR platform navigation and school improvement team plan requirements and plan components. Schools prioritize indicators based on the most pressing needs for their school community, and currently these are 3 of the indicators that are notable based on a varied level of student and family needs in response to the pandemic. Academic and behavioral support, social emotional support, and family communication and partnership are key priorities for many schools. These indicators are closely aligned to the MTSS framework and its critical components, and these key areas also align with principals' professional goal plans. Just would like to conclude this section by offering gratitude and compliments to our school leaders who have done really impressive work during challenging times. Schools remain focused on high yield practices to achieve the positive outcomes for all students. We'd like to offer special thanks to our principals and school improvement chairs for their tireless work to lead their teams. These roles require many hours of work above and beyond the norm, but our schools could not operate without their dedication. Schools have modified their plans accordingly to meet the current challenges. Cohesive and intentional professional learning teams practices have become even more critical for success in our schools. A primary challenge ahead of us is to ensure that multi-year work occurs through the MTSS process and framework to address the impact of the current context. I'm now going to turn it over to Drew Cook and Alicia Miller, who will expand on this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Leanne as well. Good afternoon, Chair Scott, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board. I just want to provide a quick bit of context for this second segment of the presentation today before turning it over to Alicia Miller. As was highlighted in the opening, the purpose, of course, of school improvement and the school improvement process is to do just that, improve achievement and outcomes for every student. And we do that by continuously and collaboratively working to analyze data and make decisions, all while focusing on the unique needs of a school and their students, academic, behavioral, and otherwise. MTSS is, of course, the framework and the structure that drives that work. As Ms. Alford Keith and Mr. Epler pointed out, I think in slide 8, our primary challenge right now, among others, is working to utilize this pre-existing pre-pandemic structure and framework to guide our efforts and strategy while at the same time identifying those areas where we've got to make adjustments or significant changes given, of course, the extraordinary challenges that our schools and our students are experiencing. And in some cases, the same processes might be quite effective in addressing those needs, while in other instances, the district and our schools are having to make some significant changes in order to better tackle the unprecedented issues and challenges that we are currently facing and likely will be for the foreseeable future. I think, as you know well, perhaps the fundamental and overarching challenge that our schools are facing right now really involves balancing the reality of having larger numbers of students who are struggling, both in volume and also in intensity of their needs, whether we're talking about academic performance, as we've discussed in this meeting and others previously, grades, attendance, or even social emotionally, while simultaneously working to overcome some significant limitations on capacity and time, given all the other myriad of issues, tasks, and responsibilities associated with the safe and effective operation of schools during the pandemic. And I think that's really the difficult juggling act that our schools are engaged in right now. And I think it's important in the context of this conversation today to point out the reality that even, when a vaccine comes and things begin to improve, hopefully in the very near future, the reality is, and we have to be very transparent about this challenge, the reality is that this is not a one-year issue. This is going to be a multi-year challenge that will, I dare say, define the focus of our districts and really all district efforts for the foreseeable future for years to come. And so, we're just scratching the surface today in terms of sharing with you kind of an update on how school improvement can be the foundation of our strategy and help us define some of the details of that work. But we also have to be prepared and are preparing and are working for the reality that new challenges in some instances will call for new strategies and new courses of action. And I think, obviously, we're still in the early stages of this. And to talk a little bit more in more detail about some of the work that's ongoing in terms specifically of how the school improvement and MTSS framework supports students during the pandemic, Alicia Miller is here with us today. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Alicia to kind of close out the presentation.
Thank you, Drew. As Mr. Epler indicated, the A401 School Improvement Indicator is one of the top prioritized indicators in schools. And this indicator is around schools implementing a tiered instructional system that allows teachers to deliver evidence-based instruction that's aligned to individual needs of students across all tiers. Mr. Cook just set the context for us in Wake, but we're also beginning to see just even nationally, initial research and articles are beginning to emerge in the field of education showing what the potential short and long-term effects of COVID-19 is on student learning loss. And so one of our teaching and learning challenges in our current tiered instructional system is that more students are demonstrating a need for additional supports and more intensive supports, both academically and in behavioral health, in a context where we are experiencing capacity limitations in areas such as staffing. And so as we think about this tiered system of approach, the framework and components of MTSS are going to be essential in supporting schools, both in the immediate efforts of providing relief, but then also in the long term of as we begin to do recovery and rebuilding of some of our systems and structures. Within the context of MTSS, it's really important to note that it's not about labeling students as tier 1, 2, or 3, but rather it is about identifying that targeted academic and behavioral health, the instruction, the curriculum, and the supports that are going to be needed for our students. When we think about where we've been impacted most, because there are more students who are demonstrating a need, our current circumstances have caused a shift and disruption within our instructional core. When referencing the instructional core, it really is that relationship and interaction between the teacher and the student and the content, and not any of those qualities one by themselves, but how they're interdependent and interact with one another within the core. To mitigate the learning loss, it's going to be essential and is essential for us that as we're identifying evidence-based strategies, interventions, and innovations that are going to support these interactions in the instructional core, that they are founded on evidence-based research as we begin to problem solve around this. We don't have enough resources or capacity to intervene our way out of core instruction. And so this is where we're going to be doing the heavy lift and the focus within that tiered instructional support. And as Mr. Cook mentioned, this isn't a quick fix, but this is going to be a continuous school improvement challenge that's going to be a long road before us with multiple years of recovering and rebuilding. But despite this challenge, schools are currently actively working to overcome this challenge to mitigate some learning loss. And so as Mr. Epler referenced earlier, school-based teams such as our school improvement teams, administration teams, student support services, our intervention teams, and PLTs are engaging in database problem solving to identify the patterns and trends of academic, behavior, and social emotional learning gaps, as well as the root causes and the factors that are underlying and contributing to some of these gaps. This next slide is really to kind of outline just some of the data points that many of our schools are beginning to look at. It's now important now more than ever to be triangulating both historical and current data to assess the academic and behavioral health learning losses that our students are experiencing. In previous meetings, we have talked with you about the grades and attendance. But they are beginning to triangulate that to have a more comprehensive picture of both individual students, but then also all of the health and well-being of the core across grade levels and content areas. They're beginning to integrate data such as family engagement data and student engagement data. Many of our schools are either leveraging surveys, both to families and students, as well as focus groups, because we know that in order to develop the right solutions and strategies is going to be elevating the voice of our families and students to ensure that we are intervening in the right places to support our students and families. Additionally, our schools are beginning to also triangulate and integrate our learning management system and digital resource usage data to determine whether students are participating, where their level of engagement is. Is it across specific content areas? Is it all content areas? To be able to support where they need to support individual students, but also large groups of students to engage both in the online learning environment. Additionally, a key data source that many of our PLTs and schools are using are formative assessments, those real-time assessments that are really mastery learning measures to be able to say, did the students master what the content was that I taught today? An example of that is teachers using exit tickets at the end of a live instruction session to ensure that learning has occurred. The other piece where, teachers and PLTs they're leveraging district resources that we've provided in formative assessments that they are able to assess students prior to teaching a unit or content to ensure that students have the essential standards and knowledge and skills that are necessary in order to access the grade level content that is in the upcoming unit of study. And so teachers are beginning to use both pre and post to be able to determine learning that is happening in both in person, but also in a remote learning environment. And then additionally, they are integrating that behavioral health needs assessment so that we can really look at the entire picture of our students, both from an academic, but then also the behavioral health and social emotional learning aspect. And so as they are using this data to determine needs, the schools, as outlined by my colleagues, are beginning to make adjustments and determine responses to their data. The school improvement process and the framework of MTSS is what is systemic, but the solutions and supports that schools are providing are personalized, and they are matched to a school's needs and the root causes that are being identified through the database problem-solving process. And so while our schools are maintaining a focus on the health and safety of our students and staff, they are no doubt rising to the challenge to implement a tiered instructional system to be able to mitigate the learning loss in this ever-demanding context and environment. The systems and supports listed here are not meant to be an exhaustive list, but rather just examples of actions in schools that they are taking to support student needs. Some of those there at the top there are really about focusing in on core instruction, ensuring that our students are engaged and are able to access the core curriculum and the resources that we've provided. Additionally, the supports that are being provided to teachers are examples that we've shared that are being provided quarter by quarter, are vertical bridge resources to be able to look at the vertical alignment of standards from previous grade levels to the current grade level in the specific unit of study that they're in, as well as common assessments. And some of our resources have mini lessons to be able to provide to the core instruction when there is a determination that large groups of students within core do not have the standard or skill that is needed to access that core instruction. And so we've created mini lessons for our teachers to be able to provide that before teaching the unit of study to be able to mitigate those gaps in the learning loss that has occurred. Just once again, and reiterating, I think schools are recognizing that we don't have enough resources to intervene our way out of core, and so many of them are doing that heavy lift of core instruction. They're beginning to also look at their grading practices and revisiting their grading plans. Schools are adjusting their grading norms to appropriately and consistently assess student learning and ensure that it's not a punitive measure. An example of grading norms that they are integrating is that ensuring that we're not penalizing the student's grade due to a lack of access to materials and instruction in a remote learning environment, and ensuring that we are assigning grades after a student has had adequate guided and independent practice and feedback from the teacher. Additionally, some of our schools are aligning their grading practices not only across a PLT, but they are choosing to do it across their entire school so that they have alignment across all PLTs in their building. Additionally, schools are also beginning to explore innovative ways of using funding. An example from one of our elementary schools is that typically they had a funding resource that they would use to serve food at family engagement events. And so now what they're looking at is ways of looking at their data and determining what are the resources and supports and maybe supplies that our students and families are needing in order to engage in the core curriculum, either virtually or face-to-face, and are buying those resources and providing them to their families, such as manipulatives and other resources to access the core. And additionally, in speaking about family engagement, we know that where we have strong relationships and connections with our families is where we have better outcomes for our students. And so schools are continuing to develop creative ways to engage families in the problem-solving process, both for individual students as well at the school improvement level, to elevate their voices and ensure that they are a part of the decision-making process for their individual students, but also as a part of the entire school improvement process. Additionally, in supporting core instruction, one of the ways that schools are beginning to is adjusting their PLT schedules Many of our schools are determining, because we are seeing students who have such a need for those supplemental intensive services, our special education students, our EL student learners, that they are beginning to adjust the amount of time, but also when their PLTs are scheduled. Many of them are choosing those asynchronous learning days so that they can have vertical and horizontal alignment and collaboration with those instructional support teams and resources in their building, so that they can help them problem solve around needs that their PLTs have for their specific students and grade level. And finally, as we know, that schools are really having to become incredibly creative with staffing strategies. They are adjusting schedules and leveraging other staff to provide small group intervention supports to those students who are needing these services. And we know that currently we have to acknowledge that this is another example of where staffing, already stretched thin, is making it more of a challenge to provide some of these targeted supports that are needed now more than ever. And so, just in closing, these are just a few quick ways in which schools are beginning to provide relief currently to mitigate the learning loss, knowing that this is a long-term road of looking at recovering and rebuilding as a part of the continuous school improvement process. In supporting this development of a tiered instructional system and how we're responding to and building systems and structures and supports for students across these tiers of support. And our principals and teachers, they are remaining steadfast in responding to the ever-evolving conditions with noteworthy empathy, flexibility, and creativity. And so we applaud their tireless work of continuous school improvement on behalf of our students and our families. And so with that, that concludes just kind of our brief presentation at this time on school improvement and school and student support. And we are happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time.
If I could also interject that on tomorrow's board meeting agenda, there are a couple of consent items associated with school improvement and the requirements that we had to fulfill this year, including those for our designated low-performing schools. So we thought it was important to bring this update in Student Achievement Committee prior to looking at those items on the consent agenda.
Thank you for that, Superintendent Moore. And I did just want to point out to my colleagues, and I believe this is also in the second document that was in your file folders, that I believe is also in the assembly for those who want to look at the second document that's titled School Improvement Presentation, that has the overview that really does, I think, a great job of summarizing the presentation that we just heard. And I do want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for explaining the many different aspects that go involved into these school improvement plans that are important any time of year, but particularly right now as we monitor the impact of COVID on our schools. And that will be something that we'll be responsible for mitigating for quite some time. So we'll open that up for questions. Dr. Martin.
Thank you. And the school improvement planning process is incredibly important. It's part of the reflective practice that's important for any educator. What I was a little surprised in your presentation was to hear the focus primarily on student learning loss. What I'm hearing from teachers is, in addition to learning loss, there are many examples of incredible learning gains. Where there are the learning gains that I'm hearing are where students are really discovering, their abilities with self-agency. So much of our traditional education has become very, very mechanized. As one teacher sort of described it, we've tended to, when kids are struggling, sort of lay down a trail of breadcrumbs for students to follow, and we then define our performance as, hey, we followed the breadcrumbs, yay, we learned. And it seems to me that following the breadcrumbs trail is where we're seeing the greatest learning loss. But where students are having that self-agency, that are sort of digging in and taking some of that independence of learning, we're actually seeing major learning gains. And so I guess my question is, are we looking at where we're seeing the successes, and can we use that information to maybe inform where the challenges are? It really reminds me of going back to the work of Carol Dweck, educational psychologist out of Stanford University, who differentiates performance-based learning from mastery-based learning. And her work very clearly shows that the focus on mastery really is building that self-agency, and those students tend to succeed, whereas those who are just focused on the performance tend to really run up against major challenges. I think that's what we're seeing. And so I guess my question for the student improvement plan process is, how can we look at the areas of success to inform the areas of challenge?
So, Dr. Martin, I think I can start, and others certainly can jump in with more specific. First of all, I think your point is well taken. You are right. And really, our intent with kind of extending the presentation and providing more detail and specifics around student supports was in recognition of the request from this committee and board members to be a little bit more explicit in some of the details of the work, kind of as a follow-up to some of the data that we have shared and discussed after the first quarter learning period. But Dr. Martin, you're absolutely right. I think part of the work, and really, quite honestly, the framework for school improvement in MTSS is itself designed to do exactly what you just described, which is to, for example, whether it's at the school level or at the district level, to identify, and there are many incredible examples of systems, structures, frameworks, and strategies that are having a profoundly positive academic impact on our students. And I think that the school improvement structure is designed for us to not just, as you've referenced, not just focus on those students that are needing additional interventions and more intensive supports, but also identify those strategies that appear to be having the greatest impact, to be the most effective, and working to replicate those across a school or across the district to elicit the same impact for other students as well. And I think you're certainly accurate from a standpoint of the focus of the presentation. Much of it is on support, given our previous discussions, but I don't think it should be lost that there's an awful lot of really positive work that's occurring. And I think some of those same strategies, Dr. Martin, that are having a positive effect for one group of students, it stands to reason can also have a profoundly positive impact on other students, whether it's another student in another school, or maybe in more likely scenario, when we're talking about school improvement, another student in their same school, perhaps with even in the same PLT, to identify what measures seem to be having the most positive effect and ensure that that is systemic rather than anecdotal and isolated.
Thank you for that, Mr. Cook. And did we have, I'm sure we have lots of questions. Ms. Kushner, or Dr. Martin, were you? Okay, thank you. Ms. Kushner?
Thank you, Ms. Scott, and thanks for the presentation to staff. And to piggyback, I think Dr. Martin has highlighted that, our strategic plan talks about the 4 C's. We've talked about the growth mindset. So I think as we come out of this pandemic, those would be where I would hope we focus. And there was a fair amount of jargon in the school improvement plan. So when we talk about engaging our families and school communities, how are these school improvement plans being translated to the non-educator that is our typical in our families, and even our students? Is there student input that's taken when we're engaging at the school community level?
I'm happy happy to speak to that. We do have many schools who are engaging their students. It's especially become a common practice that student equity teams are involved in giving input on school improvement plans, or that focus groups are used to gather some of the data that informs a plan. And you're right, this system, the NC STAR system, has a lot of jargon in it, so a lot of that comes into the plans. But it is also a practice that many of our family engagement events, now virtual, in person in the past, unpack the school improvement plans for the parents or the families that are there and share what are the key priorities for the school. So that is an ongoing process that continues in the development of plans, now that plans have been developed, and then moving forward, whereby the goals and the vision of the school improvement plan really do drive those other engagement opportunities with our families and our students.
Thank you, Ms. Alford Keith. And now that you mentioned both equity and going virtual, so I have two additional questions. I'll just whoever can answer them. But one was on our equity on slide 20. I was concerned to see that it's student demographics, and it's been kind of grayed out, as has the behavioral health and SEL. So my two questions are: how are we truly viewing the data through an equity lens so that we can make sure that we're focused on student strengths and student need, and also how has SEL changed going to a virtual environment? I think we're getting a lot of questions from both the public and educators about our capacity to support students' social and emotional needs.
So I'll just say that those are grayed out on slide 20, just to give the recent example of database problem solving around grades and attendance. That is the same slide that was slide 12, where we talked about all three, but just chronologically, we were doing most of our equity and social emotional unpacking earlier, before we had the Q1 grades and attendance data. And then more recently, we're building on the database problem solving that we had done around SEL and equity beginning the school year with the first quarter grades and attendance data.
I'm glad I misread that a bit. Thank you. I would love to get more details on how SEL has moved virtually, and what are our needs, and how can we support expanding that capacity given the pandemic's strains on both our community and our educators. That is a continuing question.
Absolutely, and that is an important question. And before I shift to other questions, I'm going to piggyback off that just a little bit, because I was curious about the same thing. When we look at A406, that all teachers are attentive to students' emotional states, guide students in managing their emotions, and arrange for supports and interventions when necessary. As our schools have been looking at this during the first quarter, what types of supports are we offering to our educators in the virtual/hybrid environment to help them continue working on that goal? Does that look different than? I'm sure it does. And what types of supports have we been offering our teachers?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ms. Scott. I know we spent some time in a previous session talking in more specifics around SEL supports. First of all, I think, and I think Ms. Kushner had the same question as well. One thing that I can say at a broad level is that maybe counterintuitively and maybe ironically, the move to a fully virtual environment, a fully remote environment, at least to start the school year, I think required us to think outside the box in ways to maintain connections with our students and with our families, but also with our teachers, in ways that perhaps we haven't been as intentional in engaging in the past. And so I think, going back to Dr. Martin's comment about some of the positives that we've seen through the course of this school year, all the challenges notwithstanding, one of the areas that I believe stands out is the fact that we have been able to be more intentional in creating opportunities for virtual celebrations, for example, and check-ins with teachers and with parents and families, and thinking in ways and acting in ways that perhaps we haven't been as concrete and intentional about in the past, that I believe have helped to create connections and relationships and engagement in a way that, probably couldn't have been predicted given some of the circumstances and challenges that we're facing. So there may be others on the call here that can add more details, but I do think that it has required us to rethink in many ways all those efforts at support, because if we don't attack it from an intentional approach, then obviously those barriers are going to exist and make academic learning and student performance all the more challenging despite our very best efforts.
Just to add to that a little bit, really great points. I think, there's been two sides that schools have approached as well, as far as how can we adapt our traditional practices into this new medium, and then also what new practices can we incorporate into what we do. And one example is just that licensed staff did participate in professional learning courses through Learning Central, such as like instructional design and to blend it in an online learning environment and communicating with students and families in those environments. So providing a little bit of a foundation for how do we do this work within this different setting. And then you also see, I think, these reflected within school improvement plans as far as some of the adaptive practices that schools have pulled from traditional things they've done in the past, and how are we going to do this within this setting to support students in this new way.
And I appreciate that. I just know as I was reading over some of the school improvement plans, just looking at the way that was described within them, there's not a lot of change. There's not a lot of change to what things look like right now. So that I appreciate those points. And Ms. Johnson-Hostler, okay, thank you.
When you started asking, I was like, does that mean she thinks we're done? Because I certainly have a list of questions. And I'll start kind of where you just left off. So I think my first question is more basic than that. How many or what percentage do you actually believe teachers know what's in these school improvement plans in level of their engagement? Because this is a lot we're saying they're going to do. And having been on a school improvement plan, it's usually one or two teachers who are engaged in this. And in my opinion, the lift has always been heavy for teachers, but it's certainly heavier now that we're virtually. And so I guess I'm curious about buy-in from the start versus creating something and then it's an expectation. So I guess that's my first question, is percentage of educators. IAs and everybody else who's responsible for what's in this plan isn't really parents or administrators, who are often the architects of these plans.
So Ms. Salford, Keith, this is Ms. Moore, if you could provide a little bit of an update around what the composition of a school improvement team, what is the guidance that is put out there and the process for approval of a school improvement plan?
And I mean virtually, because I know what the composition is. I'm just curious if we've changed it since we've been virtual, because it impacts more teachers now than ever, because it is different in terms of the expectations.
So has the composition changed or the process?
Right.
So I would just speak to a little bit of work that was happening before the onset of the pandemic, where increasing our distributed leadership has been a big focus of ours since the school improvement redesign in 2018. So there were already many more teachers, parents, TAs, and non-instructional staff who were being brought into the fold of school improvement plans. A lot of schools were working on broadening the scope of their committees. A common structure is that a committee will be formed for each indicator, and actually every staff member will support the work of the one committee. That's something that's been more popular. Another common structure is that PLTs actually feed directly into school improvement plans, and that in ongoing PLT meetings, the school improvement action steps are being discussed. So that was something that was really growing before the pandemic. And then since the pandemic, our school improvement team meetings had to become virtual. But what we're seeing when they're virtual is that some access points are lower, that you can join from wherever you are, that we can all participate together. And then, of course, structurally and policy speaking, all school improvement plans have to be voted on and approved by all staff. And our schools do a really good job of informing the staff what those plans are, even if a staff member wasn't involved in the school improvement team prior to the vote. So there have been opportunities throughout this fall for all of our staff members to give input in a virtual setting.
And I certainly appreciate you highlighting that the access point is lower, but also the workload is heavier for our educators. So I guess I'm asking for clarity that it's great. I know what the structure is. I'm asking, do we really believe that in this environment, the same level of impact and engagement is the same? Because I would say in my day job, that's impossible because people have such a different workload right now that they're okaying things that isn't right on their purview because of the fatigue of what's happening now. And I guess I bring that up because so much of this rests on their laps.
Right.
And most of the improvement plans don't change a lot each year, and so oftentimes it's human nature to say, well, I know what it says, so yeah, sure. And again, that's just the nature of the environment we're in, and I think we'd be remiss if we believe that the old process would be working in this environment at the same level of really investment in a plan.
Right.
So that's an outsider's assumption, which is why I'm asking the question for clarity, because I certainly do not know because I'm not on a school improvement team, but it's certainly a concern I would have given the current environment. So thank you for providing a response. The second question I have is for schools that don't have an equity team, what are you doing in place of that? Because you noted it as a component of a lens that they're using, and unless something's changed, all of our schools don't have equity teams. And it could have changed. I'm not aware of that.
I think that's a really great question. Leanne, maybe you and I can tag team this one together. It is great to have the structure of an equity team, but I think, something that we're immersing within the database problem solving and around the structures within PLTs is how do we equip them to have the lens of equity in all of their practices in database problem solving as they're evaluating their practices. We've leveraged the equity analysis tool that we've referenced earlier so that all teams, as they are developing practices and policies, that they're ensuring that they're asking the right questions to ensure that we are not going to continue systemically marginalizing typical populations that are typically marginalized in education. Additionally, data, when they're engaging in database problem solving, many of our schools are disaggregating the data by subgroups so that they can look at the scope of who is it that is responding and how are they responding, and where is it that we need to adjust and shift our practices to ensure that all students are responding. And so, Leanne, I'll let you add to that as well.
Now, Alicia shared what I was going to share, which was the equity analysis tool that was provided to all schools. And if they do not have an existing equity team, then other existing teams, such as the school improvement team, did consider that data.
And I'm going to ask the question that I asked every year that we pass these is, how do you evaluate that any of this is really happening? Don't worry, I ask the question every single year. And I mean, because I think it's a question that we should be struggling with, is anytime we pass a plan that is governing an entire school and all the stakeholders in it, then there should be some way to know if it's working the way we say it is. So last year I gave last time we approved them, I gave a couple examples, and I can go back and pull those. But it's certainly going to always be the question I ask about school improvement plans. Something so pivotal to the core of who we are. If you randomly ask people what it is and they don't know, then I think we should be evaluating what we believe to be happening in schools versus what's the reality. So that's not for a response, but certainly an ongoing concern I have about how do we evaluate it. And then the last question I actually do have is to follow up with Dr. Martin's point around, well, I will use my language of balancing the actual teaching and learning with content mastery. And I'm certainly curious, because I think this is probably certainly a place where PLTs are grappling with this more than perhaps the actual school improvement team itself. But as you noted, the PLT should be feeding in to the school improvement plan. And I'm curious if that's come up in any ways in these conversations with you all around using an equity tool, but most certainly the impact of virtual, of teaching actual application. And I'll use my same example that I keep using. Students have never used their cell phones as a research tool instrument. That's an application that if we have not taught them to do it, they are still struggling to figure out how to get information while they're virtual, because we now know for a fact they didn't use their phones for research or calculators or anything of those things. So I guess that's still my question is, have you all heard or experienced from PLTs how to balance that and what they believe the impact on the school improvement plan that will have?
Is someone going to address that?
So
please?
I'm going to go back to your previous question and see if I can connect the two. I know one of the questions you asked about how do we know if the school improvement plan is working? And I think you're probably speaking in specifics and then also in general. There are many indicators and objectives in a school improvement plan that do have data indicators that are required to be monitored and assessed. It's part of the continuous improvement process. And so, the more data points we have, obviously, the clearer the picture will be. But, in this environment, yes, it is a struggle to engage every teacher, every staff member with school improvement. It's not easy when you're in a building, particularly when you have larger staffs. And I know principals and school improvement teams work very hard to engage all of the staff and students, but it's certainly more of a challenge in this environment. With regard to PLTs, obviously their work, is dependent upon, I think, how a school handles messaging around the school improvement. I know when I was a principal, each week in my weekly newsletter, there was a section about school improvement. So it was always sort of at the forefront, or at least, it was my hope that it was always at the forefront. But I also know in the day-to-day work and everything else that was on the weekly bulletin that sometimes that may get lost. But I do know that school improvement teams work closely, or PLTs work very closely with the school improvement team to ensure that the work they're doing aligns. Did that answer your second question?
I not really, because I think what I'm ultimately saying is the way that we build these school improvement plans is like it's the school's strategic plan. And I'm essentially saying it's the same questions we ask ourselves as a board about our own strategic plan, right? Every decision we make, where does it fall on the strategic plan? And if it's not here, then how does it align? And should we be doing it or talking about it if it doesn't align, right? That's the point of creating a plan that is your roadmap to all student success. And I guess that's really what I'm asking us is, part of how we manage that is our own accountability, and we evaluate the superintendent based on it, right? Like that's how we do it as a board. And I guess I'm asking, does that same layer exist at the school level? That somebody is always responsible for monitoring what is their living, breathing document for that school. And And ultimately, how are we then balancing the difference of virtual right now, which is we can't just have rote learning because that's not real or realistic for online learning.
I'd just say, I think the person that is responsible ultimately is the principal at the school, but it does not, the school improvement plan reflects data review, priorities, brainstorming, strategies selected by staff that they are able to implement. And there is a progress monitoring process that goes along with all of that. There are a lot of things that schools don't get to have choices about with regards to structures or policy or assessments or other things that, for example, like with this transition to remote that we've been in for a long period of time at the beginning of the school year, that consume their days. And therefore, what is, it's the fire burning at your feet that you put out first. And so I believe that that is clearly an impact. I think it's why the state made some revisions to some flexibilities with the SIP this year, but it doesn't change the nature of the need for the work and maybe even exacerbate it based on the environment that we're in trying to do the work. So there's not a pat answer to what you're saying, but it is an issue.
The statement is more about, I believe as a board, we have to acknowledge that that's a real thing. And for us to sit here and say, oh yeah, we're going to pass these student improvement plans and we think it's all fine. For me, I can't say that because I can't imagine that our schools have the ability to do that with the current pressures they're under. And there has to be some acknowledgement of this is a plan that we've always used and we're using the exact same tools. And there is no way I can believe that the same tools work today that worked last year at the same time. And I guess for me, this is really, for me, a clarion call to our principals and our educators that I get what you're required to do, but I also think, for me, I have to publicly say, I also get that you're required to do something that isn't realistic to your day today. And to not acknowledge that isn't transparent and fair to our school folk who have to live by a plan that can't be their priority right now. Because the fire at their feet is teaching kids virtually in a way that they've never had to do before. And also, teaching methodology has to be different, not just that it's virtual, but hey, so when I give you this is how you get Desmos on your phone because your computer's down. That wasn't happening in class, right? Because that wasn't something you needed to explain because you were right there with the whiteboard. Now, they are not. So they have a whole nother layer of teaching and learning that they're having to do as educators. And these plans don't acknowledge that. And so I think as a board, it's only my due diligence to acknowledge that.
Thank you for that, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. And I would add to that, we do see different, schools embrace their school improvement plans differently as well. So sometimes we'll see parts of those plans. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Again, any time outside of COVID. Do we have any other questions about school improvement plans? It is. We went over just a little bit, but this was a long presentation and a very important one for board members to understand. So any other questions about the presentation or school improvement plans now? Before? Okay. All right. Well, I do want to say again a huge thank you to all of the members who spoke to answer our questions, to present the information to us. We know this is a very challenging time, and as we have heard over and over again, these we don't want to just teach to the test. Yet these tests, there's so much attached to them. There is so much high stakes. There are so many expectations that we have where we are supposed to meet certain points, and they're all based on standardized tests, and that's just the way this system is. And it's frustrating when we know that is not teaching any type of agency whatsoever, and that might be the most important part of our students participating in school that we want for them to gain. So I do appreciate, again, the work that we have presented to us today, and if there are no other, I don't know, Dr. McFarland, if you had anything else that you wanted to add to close this part of the presentation?
No, I just obviously appreciate everyone's really great questions, and I'm going to tell Ms. Monica Johnson-Hostler we are going to answer that question one of these years. I know you keep bringing it up, and we keep working. We know that school improvement is really difficult during this time. There's a lot for teachers to juggle, and I think we do have to be transparent and honest about lots of things that just are not normal in schools right now, because we are not in a normal environment. And so I do appreciate you lifting that up for us. So no, I think that's the ends the presentation.
Thank you for that, and that is such important question. So I appreciate my colleagues and the committee members for asking, excuse me, some great questions. And with that, the next Student Achievement Committee meeting is scheduled for January 25th. Again, thank you for your flexibility in starting this meeting a little earlier today so that we could accommodate the special called work session. So we will call this meeting to a close at 3:10 p.m. Thank you.